All right, welcome to our Pastor's Corner teaching series. In this series, we've been going through the book of James, chapter by chapter, verse by verse, and it's just for you to use for your own personal Bible study, maybe your family Bible study, or even your small group. Today, we land in James chapter 5, verse 7 to 12. James chapter 5, verse 7 to 12. So we're almost at the end of James here. So if you have a Bible, turn it on, open it up. Here's James chapter 5, verse 7 to 12. Be patient then, brothers and sisters, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, patiently waiting for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against one another, brothers and sisters, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers and sisters, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we count as blessed those who have persevered. You have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or by anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you'll be condemned. So with this passage, when we look at various aspects of it, one of the things, obviously, we always want to be in context with what's gone on before. And if you tuned in last week, it was talking about what we do with our riches. And here's the thing that I think maybe we can look into here. When things are good, when we've got our material wealth and when we've got our health, we love life and everything's great. But when things are challenging, when life gets tough, we want to get out of there so fast. We want to bail so quickly. So I think maybe that's something for us to think about as we look contextually at what's going to happen here. Because here's what James is going to get at. There's a major theme here. He repeats it. Again, when the Bible repeats itself, when a person repeats themselves over and over again, there's something important they're trying to say. And so the word patience is not a new word in this, but it's one that gets repeated quite heavily in this section. So James is talking about us, how we can look at things a little bit differently, especially when the bad things happen, especially when trials or issues come up. Now, again, this is not new. James talked about trials at the very beginning. He's, I guess, at this point in chapter 5, he's winding down the letter. He's going to remind us, the readers, and his first century readers, just don't forget about being patient in trials. Just stick it out. When times are good, it's easy, but when times are tough, stick it out. Don't just bail, work through it. And so he's talking about the idea of patience. And so he's going to illustrate patience for us in a few ways. So again, if we're going to go through a long trial or any type of trial, James is calling us to be patient. And the first question maybe sometimes we ask is why? Why do we need to be patient when it comes to trials? And so James gives us his first answer. He says, be patient because Jesus is coming soon. Now, this is something that we don't maybe talk enough about as a church community, is the fact that Jesus will come again. Now, we understand that Jesus historically came back in about 4 AD, and he lived for about 33 years. And we have historical records, obviously, so people often ask, people don't dispute whether or not Jesus was actually here on this earth because of all the evidence, not only from Christian sources, but other sources as well. But oftentimes we don't remember that after his resurrection and then his ascension, his promise is that he would return. And so there will come a point in time when he returns. And James is just reminding his own followers at this point, hey, look for the second coming of Christ. Look for Christ to return. Now, for the first century here, they were anticipating Jesus to come back very quickly. They were anticipating him to return like almost as soon as possible. And now here we are 2,000 years later, and we're still waiting for the return of Christ. But again, be patient because Jesus will come again. And this is the idea behind it, is that all those wrongs will be set right. Every single pain will be erased. All the tears will be wiped. This is what the image of Jesus coming again is, that all these things that have been broken and damaged by sin will now be restored to the way God intended it to be. No more pain, no more tears, no more fears, these kinds of concepts. And so he's trying to encourage, look beyond your circumstance, look beyond what's right in front of you, look beyond the challenges we face, and look to the fact that there will come a time when Jesus returns and all of this stuff is going to be dealt with. Now, James gives us this illustration of what patience would look like. He talks about the idea of a farmer. Now, I'm not a farmer by any stretch. I'm actually not even a good gardener, by any stretch. But the idea of a farmer is that it requires a certain amount of faith to farm, because you have to make this investment into planting seeds. So you prepare the soil, you have to plant the seed, and then you have to hope that somehow with your crops that it would be taken care of with the weather in terms of rain and the right temperatures and all these things. Now, we're not talking about how we farm today or garden today, because I can turn on my hose anytime I want and water my plants. But back then, the reliance was on the weather. And so you had to be patient and wait and trust. And the other thing with farming is that you can't accelerate growth, right? You can't accelerate how quickly corn will grow or how quickly a tomato will grow. It'll grow at the right time, and you have to wait for the harvest. And you won't know if it's spoiled or good, or if it's going to be right or wrong until it's harvest time. And so this idea of patience then, and with this idea of Jesus coming back is twofold. Is the fact that, yeah, you have to be patient and things will happen at the right time. Jesus' return will come at the right time. And so we have to exercise patience like a farmer. And then James uses another illustration about patience. He talks about having patience like a prophet. Now, back then, a prophet was someone who spoke God's words. And oftentimes they were words of judgment or challenge to the current society or to the current religious leaders or to the current people. And often those words were harsh. And so prophets back then, why did they need patience? Because they were going to be mistreated as a result of what they were saying. They were going to be outcast. They were going to be disrespected. They were going to be beaten even. They were going to be thrown in jail even. And so they were hunted down by others in their hometowns even. So prophets suffered as a result of prophesying on behalf of God. Now, that's the idea there, is that we would be patient like the prophets. Yes, we will go through suffering. We will go through challenges as a result. We will do the right thing. We will do what God is asking us to do, but it's not going to be smooth. It's not going to be easy. And so when those things happen, we need to think of patience like the prophets. Yes, they were doing the right thing. They were saying the right thing. They were following and obeying what God was asking them to do, and yet they suffered tremendous pain and loss as a result of doing that. So we need to exercise patience and to see clearly as well how the prophets did things. And then James's third illustration of patience is to be patient like Job. Now, the story of Job can be found in your Bible in the book of Job. And of course, if you know the story of Job, is that he lost everything that he had, from his family to his material possessions and even to his health. And during that entire time, Job was not willing to disrespect or dishonor God. And even though his wife was encouraging to do so, even when his friends were telling him to do so, just curse God and die, they would say. But he was patient. And in fact, today, people do still use the expression to be as patient as Job. So the idea of being patient is that this man lost everything, even though he was a God-honoring man. And it's a simple reminder, again, just because bad things happen doesn't mean God's punishing you. There is a greater purpose to it, that sometimes we need to be patient to then see later down, because later on Job gets to see a bit more of God. He doesn't understand why and what happens, but he just gets to see more and more of God. And in fact, God blesses him after the fact. So we're called to be patient also as an illustration like Job. We're given here at this point this idea of reflecting and understanding that God is compassionate and merciful. And the hard part is that when we go through trials and when we're going through suffering and we're trying to be patient with it, what are we going to hang our hat on? What are we going to build our foundation on? And it's the idea to trust that God is full of compassion and full of mercy. That God is not being vindictive. God is not being angry towards you. He's not punishing you, but to rely more on looking at these attributes of his compassion and mercy. The idea of compassion is this gut-wrenching emotion. It's like you feel it in your gut, they say. It's this feeling of great love and tenderness and kindness. And mercy is the idea of never getting what you really deserve. We all deserve huge punishment, for our sin, but we never really receive that because of God's mercy through Jesus Christ. And so we have this idea of trust in God's compassion and mercy. Look to that instead of just looking at our own suffering. At this point, I want to take us through something that a lot of times we have a misunderstanding of. A lot of people and Christians will say this, God will never give us more than we can handle. And while that sounds great, it's not a very biblical term. You don't find that actually in your Bible at all. And where we get that from, I don't know, but the idea that God will never give us more than we can handle is not a very, very biblical concept. In fact, I think God would give us more than we can handle, so that we would rely on his compassion and his mercy, that we would go back to him and rely on his strength, to realize that we are not as strong as we think we are, and to fully be able to rely on God. And so that's where James calls us to be patient, to be as patient as a farmer and a prophet and as Job, because we're going to have to go beyond ourselves to endure. We're going to have to go beyond what we're capable of to endure, and we need to go find refuge and strength, compassion and mercy in God himself. In this last section here, James says, above all, my brothers and sisters, do not swear, not by heaven or by earth or anything else. All you need to say is a simple yes or no, otherwise you'd be condemned. And sometimes I'm puzzled by why this part is here, and maybe this has something to do with it. As we think about the very fact that we will all struggle, sometimes we're worried about how we will respond. Now, he's not saying do not swear as in, watch your language, don't use bad words. It's not that. Some people think, is it about making promises like swearing an oath? And while there may be some connotation to that, it may not necessarily be about that. Some people think, oh, don't take God's name in vain. Like when we say OMG, right? Like, no, it's not actually that. And the whole concept of taking God's name in vain doesn't really mean that either. But what it really is talking about, I think, is this. When we go through trials and we go through challenges and we need to be patient in our sufferings, be honest. At all times, be honest. James uses Jesus' words here. Simply say yes or no. And Jesus talked to let your yes be yes and your no be no. And the context of when Jesus said it was, be honest in all circumstances. Now, what does that mean for us if we're going to be in trials and need to be patient? Be honest. When someone comes and asks you, how are you doing? Oftentimes, we're not honest. We simply say, I'm fine. Everything's okay. And especially when we're going through trials or challenges, that's the worst thing we can say. Then we're not really letting our yes be yes and our no be no. We are, at this point, violating this idea of our integrity. That if we are being honest, we would say, I am struggling. I am going through something difficult. Or be humble enough to say, can you pray for me about this? I think that's what James is getting here in this context, is that we have all this talk about being patient, all this talk about challenges that we face in life. And he's saying, be honest with it. Brothers and sisters, be honest with it. That we don't have to have it all together. We don't have to pretend like we're okay. We don't have to pretend that everything is fine. He's saying, be simple. Let your honesty be your integrity. This is something that I'm really honing in on a lot over this COVID period. I just see a lot more of our own personal lives on social media, or even our world leaders and how they do things. And people are looking for real. People are looking for honest. There's enough fakeness out there. There's enough fake news out there that people are struggling. And I think this will be the call of Christians over this next while, is how will our honesty and integrity be viewed over this next while? And so if we're going through trials and challenges, we don't need to swear by what is false. We don't need to pretend like everything is okay. Simply let our yes be yes and our no be no. If I'm going through a struggle, I'm going through a struggle. I can ask you to pray for me. If everything is fine, I'm saying, yeah, everything is fine. So that's the challenge before us there. Now, what are we going to do with all this? One of the hardest things I think when people ask is, can you pray for patience? Because when you pray for patience, one of the ways in which you're only going to learn patience is when everything in the world that comes into your life challenges your patience, whether it's your spouse or your kids or your job. Things will come before you that will extend your patience level, and you'll be challenged by that. So if you're going to pray for patience, just be aware that that's what's probably going to happen, is that you're going to have your patience tested and tried until we learn to grow it at that point. And so that's one thing to consider, is to take James's advice here. When we're called to be patient, just use these illustrations in our head of what does it mean to be like a farmer or a prophet or even like Job. But my real challenge here is this. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Christians to live a life of integrity and honesty. That if things aren't okay, if we can't tell our own community that we're not okay, I don't know who else we're going to tell. And if we can't be honest with our own community, I don't know who else we can be honest with. But let's not put on a mask. Let's not put on a face that says everything's okay when things aren't okay. But if things are okay, let's give glory and honor back to God because he's the one who deserves it. And so let our yes be yes and our no be no. So that's it for our teaching time this week on Pastor's Corner. We'll see you next week as we try to continue out and close out this book of James. Love and peace.